think one of the biggest challenges for us, not just necessarily in PPC, but across all channels, is the kind of change in consumer behaviour that we've seen over the last few years. So, you know, the way that people behave online now, as I'm sure you're aware, is very different to how people behaved 3, 4, 5 years ago. And actually shopping behaviours specifically on Google have really, really changed. What we tend to see now is that people are doing a lot more research before they buy. They used to be a little bit more impulse buying, I would say, but not quite the case anymore. So I think what we're having to do is adapt to some of the new formats that Google are bringing in. So Performance Max has been the big one that everyone's been talking about for the last few years, but also adapt how we're running and structuring those campaigns based on user behaviour.
So obviously you're seeing these big changes in user behaviour. I suppose one of the things is like people coming in from adverts, sort of scrolling around a bit and then jumping straight back out again, and then sort of using the Google Shopping like they might do a catalogue or a listing page.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's a big challenge, because obviously if those ads are paid, every time someone clicks back out, clicks back in again, that's going to drive up your costs.
Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening. We're seeing that click-through rates can rocket for some people, but the detriment is conversion rate. So we're seeing a lot at the moment that the products that people are clicking on aren't necessarily the products that they go on to buy. And actually the way that we're looking to structure campaigns is more based on how the user behaves rather than what Google tells us. So actually we're doing a lot of work to understand what are the aspirational products that people see and click on and think, oh, I'd really like that, versus what do they then go on to buy. But then the next step is when they get onto site and they've clicked on that aspirational products, how do you get them to go through to those final products?
And that's really interesting. Back in the day, I used to work with a large fast fashion client, and what we used to find was that if we put very sensible clothing into the adverts would perform worse than perhaps some of the more high contrast colours and some of the more out there stuff. And actually the reason for that is that black dresses will sell themselves almost, but actually the thing that brings people in, is the thing that grabs their attention, is actually the novelty. Yeah. And it's that standout product, that wow factor, that draws that emotion, that sort of drives people into the website. And I suppose, speaking back to your point about the behaviours changing now, it's a case of like trying to sort of design those list pages so that when people come onto a product page, they land onto it. If they don't like that product, or they don't trust it immediately for whatever reason, what's around that product used to be a description of that product. Increasingly, we're seeing tests around sort of bringing a catalogue onto that page, so similar products, outfits, bundles, all of that good stuff. So seeing, I suppose, lots of challenges in like the automotive industry, because companies like Auto Trader, where it didn't have as much competition historically, are now seeing loads and loads of new entrants into the market. And I suppose that's going to increase competition from like a user experience perspective, but also from an advertising perspective as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're lucky enough to work with a few automotive clients, actually one quite major one, and that's definitely a trend that we've seen over the course of the last year. It's a really saturated industry now, which it didn't used to be, and it has meant that, you know, the CPC spikes, costs are a lot higher than they used to be. We've actually done some really, really innovative work for that client over the last 6 months or so. We were one of the first advertisers actually to get onto the Google vehicle ads beta, which is really, really cool. It's like shopping ads but for vehicles. Since we've implemented that strategy for them, we've seen loads of really good results. We've actually increased leads by 99% for that client since we took them on board. Nearly 100. We'd love it to be 100, but it is 99%. There is a lot that we can be doing for them, but you're absolutely right. What we have to bear in mind is the impact of competition. And unfortunately, even whilst we're bringing in those new features, CPCs are going to continue to rise because the market is getting really saturated. But we're doing everything we can, and we can see some really good results starting at the moment.
That's really interesting. And I suppose that industry trend of that sort of new template, those new layouts, is going to be perhaps brought out across other stuff as well in the future. So that sort of shopping behaviour of flicking between different landing pages is going to become really important. So making sure that you're optimising your landing pages based on the traffic, the level of intent, what they've seen immediately before is going to become more and more important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the general theme that we're seeing as well is that the new products that Google tend to be bringing out, like vehicle ads, like Performance Max, all speak to this changing user behaviour and the fact that people are using the shopping page like a catalogue, clicking back and forwards. You need as much information on that page as possible to entice a user to be able to get them to site. And that kind of speaks to the level of competition there is at the moment as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose as well, like traditionally people thought of like their homepage as their shop window. So like that's where all the brand messaging was, that's where all the trust signals were, that's where the value proposition was. Now increasingly it's like people are walking through a door and they're in a retail environment, and if they're not familiar with it, all of those things like the trust signals, the social proof elements, they play an increased role for people who have never seen or heard of a business before. How can they get that right is really important.
Big issue that we're facing at the moment, and very, very recent, is changes to consent mode, everything that's going on with the cookie over the next year or so. What the impact that we've seen for a lot of advertisers over the last few weeks is actually when consent mode has been implemented, we're seeing, from a tracked perspective, traffic dropping off, conversions dropping off, and the impact of that for us is bid strategies have really, really little quality data to work with. So from your perspective, what do advertisers need to be doing at the moment to combat this?
So I suppose cookie stuff, there is a legal aspect to this. You have to be compliant. So the first thing is to check that you are. You'd be surprised how many businesses actually aren't compliant at the moment, or are in what I describe as some kind of grey area, but that grey area will get tighter and tighter. The other thing to consider is the design of the opt-in cookies are not all equal, and actually some of them are really, really good at subtly encouraging people to accept them, and they've been tested as such to do that type of thing. Now, obviously, there is a line here between being legal and being too pushy, but I would suggest that by designing the optimum and testing it and remaining within that compliance zone, you can probably increase the amount of people who are giving you their first-party data. On top of that, look for other areas to get consent. So if they haven't consented in the first interaction and they're further on along the journey and they're starting to be now display signs that perhaps they are interested in purchasing from you, is there something you could do further in the journey to try and encourage them to then give you consent after the fact? So there's lots of opportunities in there. So what are the considerations from your side, I guess, to deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. First-party data is obviously everything, and the way that bid strategies work on all paid platforms is they're only as good as the data that you give them. So even in instances where we are seeing that overall tracked traffic is reducing, the thing that I want to see as many advertisers do as possible is be pushing to include micro conversions in the data that's being tracked as well. So there's lots of different metrics that we would really push for advertisers to be including in their micro conversions at the moment. So things like email signups, add to basket clicks, product clicks, page scroll depths, all of this is really valuable data that we can be feeding into the bid strategies. The more data that they are given, the better they're going to optimize and the better they're going to understand what a potential customer looks like, what a customer who comes onto site but doesn't end up purchasing looks like, so we can make better decisions off the back of that as well. So the big thing for us is any data that you can get, feed it into the platforms because it's going to make a big difference.
And I suppose that's really interesting because like back in the sort of UX and sort of digital analytics perspective, it's the type of data that we'd use when we're trying to diagnose what's wrong with a website. We're looking at page click scroll depths, add to basket ratios, all this type of stuff to try to understand which pages are performing and which ones aren't. And I suppose it's that continuation of that we can now use that data to better understand the customers and what it is they're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think historically, paid advertisers, we're an acquisition channel. We always view all of that stuff as not necessarily our problem, but it is increasingly our problem now. And the collaboration between the two channels is so important for success with all of our advertisers with relation to how the cookie is going. Like, we all have to work together to get the right data.
Are you seeing challenges where, so for example, sometimes accounts are being run and perhaps the adverts are doing what they're supposed to do in terms of clicks, but then people aren't converting, and there's sometimes perhaps the website is letting the side down?
Yeah, so often. It's been a historical challenge for us that I think previously we've had lots of instances where we're driving quality traffic to a website, but actually when a person gets to the website, they're not converting. And our job is kind of done from our perspective. When people get to the website, it's like, it's your problem. You need to optimize to make it better for users. More and more so though, it's all of our problem. It's not a good enough excuse anymore. So like, we do need to be collaborating and working together to get the journey working right.
And yeah, and that's it. And considering like those adverts, what did they see immediately beforehand? What is it they've clicked? And then trying to make sure that, like you said, we're working together, opportunities to run experiments through things like Google Ads now, so we can take alternative URLs and we can sort of test to see if we can decrease those CPAs in the platform using different pages. All of this stuff actually is a really integrated way of working and is necessary now, I guess.